So my name is Patrick Blades, and I'm with the Planning and Urban Design Department. With us on the call, we also have Sandra Bowie. She's going to be helping out with the running of the meeting. We also have Spanish translation available. And really quickly, I also wanted to introduce our Director of Housing, David, who is joining us here as well. David?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Patrick, Sandra, thanks for having me today. Um, Land use planning is one of the critical components to housing development, and it's one of the factors that sometimes we don't realize how important it is until we have a project that's underway and we realize, uh-oh, we have to go through a rezoning in order to develop this project. Um, we're preparing to introduce a new housing policy to our city council tomorrow. And one of the components of that is the collaboration that's necessary for us to have across departments. So this is perfect timing for us to be here. And as these meetings continue on, I'll make sure that our staff are engaged so that we can make sure that Forward Dallas, the land use plans that come out of this work are integrated into our housing policy that we expect City Council to adopt in March. So thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, no, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Again, the collaboration. So really quickly, our agenda. We're going to give a presentation on Forward Dallas. It's going to be kind of quick. I'm going to get through it pretty quickly because we want to really get into the discussion about housing and Forward Dallas. We have a couple of questions that we have pointed, and then we're also going to have some open discussion where it's going to be less guided and we're more going to be in listening mode. But as we get into the presentation, the three questions that we have kind of to keep on your mind as we go through everything is how does land use affect housing in Dallas? What are the barriers to building more housing in Dallas? And then how do we add in more housing in Dallas at different scales? So what is Forward Dallas? So it's a update to the vision plan from 2006. It's a comprehensive land use plan. What that is really is just urban planning 101, which is the city being intentional about how we want the city to develop throughout the next 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. It'll create a comprehensive land use map for the city about how we want to grow, how we want to change, and also areas that we want to keep the same. It'll also have specific goals and strategies and actions that can help us achieve those goals for the next 5, 10, and 20 years. So briefly, so how this plan works with others, as David mentioned earlier on. So, housing and land use, they're tied together. Forward Dallas is a land use and a policy plan. Now it informs and it works with other plans like housing, economic development, racial equity, mobility, and others. But it's important to note here that Forward Dallas is a land use and policy plan, not necessarily a housing plan, although they are very much tied together. So where we are in the process. So we started in September of 2021. So we're now, a year and a half into the process. We did a lot of community engagement earlier on to understand the land use issues and the concepts and everything that was going on within the community. We're now at a land use visioning section. And again, that's going back to the intentionality about Forward Dallas and urban planning, about how we want areas of Dallas to change and how we want other areas of Dallas to stay the same. What do we want those, how do we want to be intentional about planning the future of our city? So some of those land use themes that we heard early on that Forward Dallas is meant to address or make a dent in. First, housing cost, availability, displacement. We definitely heard that. We heard about environmental sustainability and environmental justice. People talked about connectivity, transit-oriented development, or only being able to get around Dallas by driving a car. I talked about economic development and revitalization, creating job centers in certain areas, or spurring, retail and restaurants in other areas where it's lacking. We also heard about urban design and identity, that sometimes there isn't great urban design or city design or community design or neighborhood design in certain places. And lastly, about rural and agricultural areas, about how either to preserve those or really to invest in those rural and agricultural areas where the city may not have invested in those before. So really quickly, what is land use? So land use is it's describing how people are using the property, right? Are they using it for a single family home? Are they using it for an office? Are they using it for a restaurant? Are they using it for manufacturing? What are they using that property for? And there's a big point here to note that the existing land use and the future land use, that they may be the same. You may be using that for a house right now, and you may be using that for a house, and the city says we're going to keep using this property for a house in the future. Or they may say this is a church right now, it can still be a church, but the future intent of that might be something different. It might be a cornfield now, and then it might be housing later. So there is a difference between how the property is being used now and how, again, intentionally, how it's going to be used for the next 5, 10, and 20 years. So it's important to note that land use and zoning are different. Land use, again, that future land use, right, that's not zoning. It informs zoning. So when the city says we want this to be some type of moderate housing, that doesn't say here are the rules for that moderate housing. The zoning would be those rules for that moderate housing. So that they're the teeth that give comprehensive land use plans like this, that give that visioning a little bit more teeth. So when we think in Forward Dallas, how the city is thinking about future land uses is through this concept called a place type. And it can seem a little abstract at first, but really think about the different types of places that you are in Dallas, whether it's a neighborhood, right? Whether it's Lower Greenville, whether it's Uptown, whether it's Bishop Arts, whether it's Buckner Terrace, one of these different types of places in Dallas. It's a combination of land uses and a combination of design that brings about a feeling of a place. And so that's really how the city is looking at future land uses for the city for the next, 5 and 20 years, that intentionality of what places do we want different areas of Dallas to be? Where do we want to keep them the same, and where do we want those types of places maybe to change or to maturate? So we have a number of different types of places that the city has started to identify. It starts with the regional open spaces, the parks, right? And this is the Trinity River, it's White Rock, it's Mountain Creek. Then you have more of a rural residential neighborhoods. Those are usually right now in the southern areas of Dallas, out near Kleberg and also near Mountain Creek, some of those areas that are a little bit more rural in nature. Then we have the traditional residential neighborhoods. Those are traditional single family neighborhoods. A lot of them were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's kind of the outer ring of a lot of neighborhoods here in Dallas. The blended residential neighborhoods, that's a neighborhood that has a lot of single family in it, but also might have a little bit of other types of land uses that are there. They usually are a little bit older communities. They have those older grid street patterns. There's more connectivity in there. It's a little bit easier to get around than using something other than the car. Then you have your urban residential neighborhoods, and this is where you say, well, now this has a lot more housing in it. These are more apartment buildings, more townhomes, and not really any single family homes. For the commercial spaces, we have the neighborhood commercial spaces. That's Lois Greenville, that's Bishop Arts. It's smaller shops, it's smaller field, it's not as large. Then you step up into the middle or medium commercial areas. That's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit more intense. You get a little bit more into then the industrial areas where we either have an industrial hub or more of a flex space. We have regional commercial spaces. This is more like North Park, the Galleria. This is more like Redbird, those type of areas that are a little bit more intense than just the shopping in the stores. This is not just a hotel or an apartment. Now this is a hotel or an apartment with a view. And last, we have the urban core. And the institutional, the campus, or the special purpose. That's Parkland, that's Methodist, that's some of the larger educational campuses that we have here in Dallas. And again, we can go, if you have questions on these, we can spend more time on it, but want to get through it so that we can really start the discussion. So right now we are developing that future place type map. we're using something called Social Pinpoint, and we'll include this link both in the chat and we can follow up with it. But it's a map that shows the entirety of the city, and it's an opportunity for you to go in and to drop a point to say, I think this should be something. And whether you say, I think this should stay as the neighborhood that it is today, as a traditional neighborhood or a blended neighborhood, or you can drop a pin in someone else and say, look, this is, it's a strip, along one of the major thoroughfares. I think this should be more commercial because right now it's lacking in those areas. So the future steps with the future place site map in Forward Dallas. So once it's adopted by council, the future place site map is a guide that helps in reviewing zoning changes. Cities in Texas that have a future land use map, and for us it's a future place type map, whenever you say we'd like to change the zoning on a property, the city goes and consults the future land use map and says, does this match the planning for the area, the intentionality for the area? And for larger areas where the future place type map doesn't match the current zoning, that's where the city would be going in and making certain changes, proactively making changes in the zoning to reflect that future place type. It'll also affect the development code in the city of Dallas. That's our zoning, right? Or just the underlying zoning in Dallas may not match the design and the aspirations of some of the future place types and what we hear from the community. So at some point, we will need to make changes in our underlying zoning to, again, achieve that intentionality that we want with how we want our city to grow and develop. Okay, so we're going to get now into the breakouts and sessions. And it's really not a breakout. It's really just an open discussion. Again, be prepared to share your thoughts, be respectful. How we're going to handle it is you're going to raise your hand. You're going to indicate that you have a question or you have a comment. Miss Bowie, my co-pilot, she's going to come in. She's going to identify you, ask your question. Then we're going to hopefully have a great discussion about it. And that's the way that we're going to work the open discussions.
Thanks, Patrick. And if you can, we're wondering if we can identify yourself with turning on your camera, if possible. And then, Mr. Baker, you have put some comments in the chat. So once we start with the questions, we will start off with you. Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, and as we're talking about housing in Dallas, like we all know we need more housing. We need better access. We need more options. We need to find ways to weave in that housing in existing communities without disrupting the fabric of it. We need to be creative about finding places to put more housing around neighborhoods through infill development. And we also have to figure out ways in which we've got to look at our more dense or urban areas and really figure out how to add in a lot more housing there. Because again, David will tell you we need tens of thousands of housing units every year for the next 10 years, right? And we can get that sometimes through building more single family. We need to build more single family housing. And we need to build more larger apartments. We need to do both of those things. But we can't build all of the housing that's needed in Dallas by just doing those two things. So we need to build other stuff like smaller things like ADUs, townhomes, fourplexes, threeplexes, or triplexes, eightplexes, smaller housing. It's sometimes referred to as the missing middle housing, right? We need to do all of those things throughout the city to help build all the housing that David says that we need. So a couple of the questions that we're going to put out there, again, how does land use affect housing in Dallas? What are those barriers to building more housing, or, specifically to weave that housing into existing neighborhoods? The barriers to build more housing and infill development and to add more housing in urban areas. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sandra and start listening and answering any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, would you like to start with your comments? And then I will be looking at hands raised. And then my co-host, if you could help me, because we have a large group today. So I'm so excited to see so many of our partners here today. Mr. Baker? If you are speaking, I can't hear you. And also, so I will read the comments that Mr. Baker, just to kick off the conversation. Other city policies like the racial equity plan, the comprehensive housing plan, the market value analysis must be taken into consideration as both the planning and zoning reviews of our neighborhoods in Southern Dallas. And another comment from Mr. Baker is agricultural uses need to be verified before club allows zoning to continue, and appropriate zoning must be placed on these tax avoiding zones in our cities. For those that might need help with raising your hand, at the bottom of my screen, there is a smiley face reactions, and there you can find the raised hand function, like I am doing now. And then to lower it, you just click.
And Mr. Baker, you're 100% correct. All of those planning efforts, whether it's economic development, racial equity, housing, the market value analysis, those all need to be taken into effect as we're developing our future place type map. And part of the rural and agricultural focus that we've tried to take a look on is not just to have that as a placeholder zoning district, but really to say, okay, if it's going to be agricultural land use out there, actually make it agricultural land use. Don't just have a horse out there to get your ag exemption.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, thank you for joining us. I believe you have been unmuted. Ken Smith, we can't hear you.
Further setup goes, was it classroom?
Okay, Shalonda, I see Andrew. Would you like to join the conversation? Hello.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for calling on me. Yeah, so I just wanted to answer some of these questions. So some of these barriers to weaving housing in existing neighborhoods is obviously like I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna beat this dead horse. It's gonna be parking requirements. We can't continue to require every single lot in the city to have so much parking. But also lot sizes. Our minimum lot size in the city is what, 5,000 square feet. And if you go historically, even like the shotgun houses that you'll see in like the 10th Street district, these are all on like 1,400 square foot lots, and we need to figure out a way to allow our lots to be smaller to I guess to place more housing in areas that don't currently allow smaller lots right now, and that would take was it chapter blanking somewhere in chapter 51 about lot patterns in a neighborhood. We need to get rid of that so that we can allow these smaller lots to be incorporated in the city. And then
Andrew, I'm going to stop you for just a moment.
Okay.
I'm hearing someone is off mute and having another conversation. If we could just make sure that we are all muted. Thank you. Okay, Andrew, and you were getting some thumbs up from some others in regarding the parking conversation. Go ahead, please. Oh, I can't hear you now.
I'm just gonna sign off now because I could keep going for 20 minutes, and I think other people need to have a chance to talk. So thank you.
We'll come back around to you.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
appreciate the comment, Andrew. Yes, we do need to take a look at the parking mandates that the city has, not just for commercial uses, but for residential uses. To your other point about lot sizes, and how the city handles those, the zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations, those are both points that, again, as we look at our future place types and say what doesn't match our current zoning and our current, Chapter 51A, those are two things that we would definitely be looking at.
Great. I'm not seeing any hands, and I know there are many on this call that have comments. Please, I know we're all inside being cozy, but we would love to hear from you. Norman Henry, Hank Lawson, Ken Smith, please join. Brent Brown, Shalandra Thompson. Please, we all have had individual conversations, and I really want to hear you share to the larger group.
Can you hear me? This is Ken Smith.
I can, thank you.
Okay, I was just saying the system says you must unmute us. That's why we weren't able to talk. We could not unmute ourselves. Okay, the first question is just really basic for me. How do the area plans dovetail into the comprehensive land use? What comes first? What comes second? They seem to be having a similar time schedule. So how do we compare the two efforts?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So if we've done neighborhood or area planning already in a community, we are taking a look at those previous planning efforts, ground truthing them with that community to say, is this still your desire, right? Is this still the intent? If it is, then we're adopting that as part of Forward Dallas. So if there were land use components of those neighborhood or area plans, they become part of Forward Dallas. If we're currently doing a area plan or a neighborhood plan, or if we do one in the future in a community, that's the process of amending the place type map, the Forward Dallas. So if we say that a community comes together and says, this is our idea for a place type today in 2023, and they say, we actually need to go back in 2028 and make some small changes, that would be through an area planning or neighborhood planning process. So just to recap, if we've already done one and it's still, right, it's still a desire of the community, that becomes part of the future place type map in Forward Dallas. If we're working on one, or if we're going to work on one in the future, that's the process through which we would amend Forward Dallas in the future place type map.
So just as a follow-up, if you don't mind, District 7, which is most of South Dallas, is in the process of, I think, finalizing the plan. Do we have a time frame on when that plan should be finalized? Who must finalize it? And does, if that were to be completed within 2 months, I'm just using that as an example, would that be finished before the comprehensive land use plan is finalized or after?
So if the area plan that's being done in South Dallas and Fair Park, with which myself and Ms. Bowie are very much a part of, if we finish that in 2 months, we would be really happy with ourselves. I don't know if we're going to get there, but that would come before the adoption of Forward Dallas. But then that plan itself would be a part of Forward Dallas. So we would just take what we are doing in South Dallas Fair Park. We'd say, this is it. And we already, on our future place type map, we already have 80 comments that came from those engagements in South Dallas, where they said specifically, this is what we want on Second, this is what we want on MLK, this is what we want in Queen City. These are some of the things that we want. You know, that visioning that they did. We already have that, or pretty far along in that process. So that vision for Forward Dallas and that vision for South Dallas and Fair Park will be a part of Forward Dallas.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have given everyone access to be able to unmute themselves. And I believe Ms. Hexel, Colorado, is next.
Hi, my name is Hexel, Colorado, live in East Dallas. My first question is, well, I have two questions, and I'll just ask them together so that you can decide how you want to answer them. My first question is, does the city maintain, or does the city have available, or Forward Dallas have available, a catalog of the different housing types that are available for conversation? For example, when we talk about the different place types, I think because a lot of people, we want to solicit feedback from as many people as possible, but a lot of people, in their mind, they only have a conception of single family detached house and apartment. And so if there isn't an opportunity for them to see the range of housing in the middle, for example, if one goes to missing middle housing.com, like you can see this wide range of different housing types that if someone were for whatever reason concerned or perhaps even scared of a large apartment building or a giant skyscraper in their neighborhood for any reason, then they could see that, oh, okay, well, Forward Dallas in their place type planning has these other housing types that are more amenable and perhaps even more desirable in terms of missing middle. So as Forward Dallas solicits feedback, do you have that kind of catalog so people can have a better understanding of the different types other than the two binary options at the polar opposite ends? And then the second question is, are there any place types or are there any, I know this is not strictly a zoning discussion, but are there any place types where housing isn't allowed? Because I would imagine that there's the only place type that shouldn't have housing is a heavy polluting place type where you have people who are putting things into the air. Other than that particular housing type, even if it's a heavy commercial or heavy industrial, but there isn't, or maybe the term is medium industrial, where there isn't a pollutant element like a bunch of FedEx offices, right? They may not necessarily have a negative health outcome, but it is a major job source. So it would be an opportunity to have housing close to employment. Are there any place types that don't are not compatible with housing, or is it fair to say that housing can be built in any place type except for the most pollutant of place types?
So thank you for the first comment. Yes, that is one of the things that the city is hopefully working on, is creating those catalogs or those visuals to show different types of housing at different scales within the city of Dallas. Either that exists today or that we are hopeful that would exist. But it is a good point because myself and others, we can talk about certain types of housing types, but showing a couple of pictures sometimes gets that message across much better. As far as your second question about where housing should not be, right? The way that you articulated it and that you were thinking about it is the same way the city is thinking about it. As in, housing should be an option in almost every place in Dallas except for where you have that incompatibleness with a heavy pollutant, really an industrial area. That housing there would not be something that, and again, crosses into a little bit of zoning, but that housing wouldn't be a component that would be allowed there by right moving forward. And so hopefully that answers both of your questions. And I guess the first question was more just pointing out things that can help us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say I would comment that urgent as I know you're working on it, which is good, and I'll just add to the level of urgency or priority, because I think anyone who's had this housing conversation before knows that unless the audience is made aware that, or helped to be aware of the other housing options, then the only thing we've got on our mind are big apartments or large lot single family detached. I think that would be very important to present as this conversation goes forward.
Yeah, totally. And we are planning to have a lunch and learn just on missing middle housing, just to talk about missing middle housing and those different types of missing middle housing, so that it is not just a single family house or a 10-story tall apartment building. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we've got an active chat going on. I believe there are some links to some of those lunch and learns that will be coming up in the April timeframe. And I'm going to pass it on. Next is Miss Farrow, and then Norman Henry.
Thank you so much. I took a look at the website Missing Middle Housing, and something that's not clear for me goes back to an earlier comment about decreasing lot size and reducing parking minimums. If we're truly serious about incorporating this missing middle housing, which by the looks of it is stacked triplexes, fourplexes, things we don't normally see throughout Dallas, we're going to need those parking minimums We're going to need the bigger lot sizes to incorporate the trees, foliage, privacy screens that make a neighborhood nice and livable, or else we're going to end up with really ugly, cramped housing that you typically see in the northeast sector of the country that I'm sure none of us really want to see here. And I'm also concerned about just in general getting rid of parking minimums. Here in West Dallas, we've seen several developments where they tried to get around having driveways and narrowing the streets, and it just turned into a really chaotic situation where people have to park diagonally, half in the street and half by their front doors, and then emergency vehicles, trucks for trash pickup, and police cars have a very difficult time going through those planned developments. So I think we really need to choose what our real objective is before we start messing with parking minimums and, you know, all of the environmental requirements that we have.
Thank you for the comment. That gets a little bit into one of the land use issues that we brought up in the beginning. Also talked about urban design and identity, because I would say you can build single family homes very poorly. You can build them really good. You can build apartments really poorly, and you can build them really good. And so the same goes for that missing middle housing. Like, as long as you have a good design, you can build it really well, or you can build it really poorly. And so part of it is understanding how we can get missing middle housing and different housing types and how we can incorporate them specifically in Dallas. So it's reflective of of Dallas's own design, and as something that's context sensitive to our community, as opposed to just plopping something down because it worked in another city or it worked in another country. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I would love to see more emphasis on preserving a lot of the trees in our neighborhoods here in the city, because I see some of the nearby suburbs doing a really great job of that, even though the developers complain. But I know my neighborhood has been absolutely decimated ecologically by just the sheer, they just come through and just scrape every single lot clean pretty much.
Yeah, I can sympathize. There was a house down the street. They took down the house. They took down two great live oaks in the front yard. Scraped it clean, in my neighborhood as well. So I can definitely sympathize. I know the city does have our tree preservation ordinance, and we do have a tree preservation overlay. Although I don't believe any community or neighborhood has taken advantage of that so far. And so part of that again gets back to some of that design and some of those policy changes and changes in our zoning and development code to do some of that preservation and that environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Agreed.
All righty. Next we have Norman Henry, and after Norman, we will have James Ornstein, and then Brent Brown. Hi, Norman. You're able to unmute?
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
You are
Okay.
good. I can hear you.
All right. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you. I was saying in the city of Dallas, there's a lot of vacant land, industrial land, commercial properties that are vacant. And there's an opportunity, maybe we can convert those to housing for middle income or essential housing, what I call it. And I was working in one city where they had the right to override the zoning in order to build more housing in the city. And they provided tax abatements and subsidies to help that happen. Because I think the existing zoning allows NIMBYism, not in my neighborhood. And it blocks a lot of development and housing for our city because the public input process is very long and cumbersome. And so maybe there could be a way to create a new zoning code that everybody can agree upon to stimulate more housing in other areas of the city that typically would try to block, housing for working families. And, we have a lot of essential workers in our city that can't even live in Dallas because, there's no housing. They have to go other places. The other thing was I like to continue to see the Dallas focus on homeownership. We have a huge homeownership gap in our city and our nation. And in order to do that, there's going to have to be more subsidies provided, uh, both publicly and private sector. So the private sector has a role to play. Like in the Bay Area in California, they raised $500 million for housing. In Atlanta, they're trying to raise $1 billion. In West Palm Beach, they're trying to raise 200 million. There's got to be both public and private subsidies to fill the gap. And the rising cost of construction, the rising cost of land is causing that gap to be bigger. Sandra and I, when we went to the mayor 7 years ago, the gap was 25,000, but it's probably more like 100,000 now. And there's not enough subsidies really to go around to help more families obtain the dream of homeownership in our city. So I think those, the NIMBYism and the zoning issue is a major problem. And then the gap money is a major challenge. If we're going to really make a difference, we've got to raise a lot of money. And I know there's people out there that want to help, but we got to have a coordinated strategy on how to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Yes, so to your first point about industrial or commercial areas that are underutilized, that's part of what ForwardDallas is looking at, especially along a lot of our corridors. We have industrial uses or quasi-industrial uses where those businesses have either been outsourced to the periphery of Dallas-Fort Worth or have just been outsourced out of the country. And so, those are underutilized areas in which you can do some really good infill housing. Same goes for a lot of the big box retail stores. You don't see the Circuit Cities and the Best Buys opening up anymore. Like you have those vacant properties. And how do we utilize those in a way to get more housing in and around our communities? And unfortunately, right now, the zoning a lot of those areas would not allow it. And if we can, through a future place type map, identify it and say this is an area where we should have housing. Hopefully, that gives staff and the community a little bit of teeth to then when that developer comes in to develop those properties, that they're able to go through the entitlement, the zoning process a little bit smoother. And my question would also be to you. So which city, you mentioned that you had worked in a city where they said, oh, we don't even care about your zoning, just go ahead and build housing if you can build housing. Which city was that?
It was Florida. And
Out in Florida. Okay.
I could send you the information. They
Yeah,
came
yeah,
up
send
with
it to me,
good
send it to
policy.
Sandra. Yeah, we'd love to look into that.
Okay, sure. I think it's something to consider. And it seemed
Yeah.
to be working.
Yeah. No, I mean, we're all ears for stuff that works. So thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay, next is James Ornstein, and then Brent Brown, and then Daryl Baker.
Hello. My name is James Ornstein. I'm actually representing a group that's interested in community solar, but the question I put in the chat was, you mentioned the housing policy update that's going to be presented to the city council tomorrow. And it's like 107 pages. So I didn't know if you wanted to take the opportunity to summarize very quickly how that relates to what we're talking about.
I think that is a great suggestion, and we're going to put David, because I know he knows it backwards and forwards. So David, would you like to give us the short version?
Sure. So the short version is that, we've spent the last 2 years examining the current housing policy that we have through a racial equity lens. And what we found was that the current policy uses a build from strength and work your way to the more depressed areas of the city over time. Well, that works in concept, doesn't really work in practice. In practice, you never actually get to the more depressed areas of the city using that approach. So what's happened is we have set up a structure where we're encouraging more development in high opportunity areas, which is helpful for those that choose to move to high opportunity areas. But for those that want to remain in their neighborhoods, we're not offering any support to uplift those areas. So what the new housing policy that's being proposed does is lay out, we're calling it 7 pillars of housing equity. And each pillar represents a factor that addresses some form of housing tools that we need to address. I won't present today because I'm presenting tomorrow. And much of what you're seeing in that briefing are appendices, right? If you look at the presentation, it's about maybe 30 pages, right? One of the key pillars is pillar number 5, collaboration and coordination. And what we're hoping to achieve through that pillar is written agreements with our other departments, whether it be planning and urban design, Dallas Water Utilities, Public Works, you name it, where we can identify priorities that each of those departments, through their plans, their policies, their initiatives, that align with the housing plans that we have for the city, and look at how we can fast track those factors. Where we have overlap is what we want to focus on. Perfect example, the city has a plan to replace pipes that were built in 1920 or prior that are in disrepair. We want to do an overlay between those 1920 pipes and our historically disadvantaged communities to figure out, well, which 1920 pipes do you replace first? And what money is allocated for replacing 1920 pipes? And what other supplemental funds can we attach to that so that we can be more impactful? So the biggest factor, because I don't want to monopolize this meeting, that we're trying to incorporate through this new policy, and you're seeing it woven into today's presentation, is cross-department collaboration and coordination with external partners. Because while we all want to, we all have a mission and a budget and staffing constraints that we use to carry out our work. For us to be impactful, we have to look at how one department's work connects to the others, so that we can start to turn the dial on neighborhood revitalization in those communities that have not been the focus of our attention.
Thank you. James, did you have anything else to add?
No, I'll let other people have a turn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Brent Brown, please. And then Daryl Baker will be next.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Patrick, for having us today. My question piggybacks a little bit on a couple of comments and David's as well. Will planning and urban design, as we go through the Forward Dallas update, look at practices and processes within the land entitlement zoning process? To elaborate, will you be evaluating, looking at, and potentially revising how we reference and apply the land use policies within the zoning process?
Uh, so well, so we have another one of these with our development community on Friday, and I think it's a great question for both of these groups. And I mean, the short answer, the simple answer is yes. The longer answer is that it depends on some of those specific constraints. Like when we had a conversation with David earlier in the week about identifying specific things where we say, okay, the reason why it takes so long to develop X, Y, or Z is because of these four things. Can we change those four things? How do we then go about making those changes? So, one part of this open discussion and the ask that we would have of people that are in housing or in the development community is, what are those specific barriers? What are those constraints? Is that policy that the city has? Is that something that we have to change in our code? Is that something that Forward Dallas can speak to? So as we get through in this process, and if you can help us in identifying any of those specific barriers, then I think we can take a look at, okay, it's platting, and here's the issue on platting. And if we can figure out how to do platting better, then we solve issues, because it no longer takes 18 months to get this, that, or the other thing. So that's, I guess, again, short answer, yes. Longer answer, we need to look at those specific things or specific barriers and see if those are things that we can change through the process.
Okay, as follow up, I'm not speaking to how we expedite vertical construction. I'm speaking to how we deliver consistency and accountability within the transition from planning and policy to transactions. And I'll elaborate. And Patrick, you know this. We have plenty of plans. We've had housing plans and policies, but our ability to execute consistently and secure performance from those plans to transactions, meaning to zoning or to the development, has been very poor. I mean, and there are a lot of people on this call that I know would tell you that they have neighborhood plans, that when development comes forward, development doesn't follow them. And so I'm expressing a strong interest and support for how the city will evaluate its decision making. I'll say it's CPC and council, to heed the plans more as a policy that must be followed or revised versus just a recommendation for consideration. And so that's different than, oh, why does it take me so long to get a plat? Versus when someone in a neighborhood goes through the process and they want density at the edges, but not, let's say, within the interior, and then somebody comes in and proposes to do something, and everybody complains it takes too long to get the zoning. But the reality is the plans were very clear that this was not desired. Now, second to that is how notification within the process works, so that there's greater outreach and availability for people to be aware of these land use changes when zoning happens. And then third, I think, to Norman's point, NIMBYism, and how do we have honest accountability within for and against at CPC, when half, sometimes the four, are consultants or members of the development team talking about in support. I mean, I watch it all the time where, a landscape architect or an architect or a person that's advising the developer speaks in support of something without declaring that they're being compensated, or that they're on the development team, or they're the land seller. So that's the stuff I'm talking about, so that we get greater transparency, greater awareness, involvement, and accountability at the city council level, that when they approve these plans, that they need to deliver on them. So thanks. Look forward to supporting you guys and working with you however possible.
So appreciate the support, and can't speak to the entirety of the comment, but what I will say is, and I've had these conversations with different members of the community who, when we say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to do this Forward Dallas meeting, they say, well, Patrick, I already did my plan in 2016. And I say, that's great. It's a advisory plan that says, these are the things that we kind of want. Part of adopting a future place type map is to say, this is what the community wants. So as an example, if they say, we know we have a church over here that might go away, we want it to be a blended place type that, has some housing, but is not a 6-story apartment building. You have that place type, you have that as your future land use map, so that when you go to CPC and council, you say, okay, this is the reason why it's, I'm building, townhomes. They're 2 or 3 stories. It's a little development. Okay, that matches the future place type. So part of the Forward Dallas process is getting that future land use map, that future place type map adopted as part of Forward Dallas, not just as an advisory, but as something that, every zoning case would then have to go and check itself against that future place type map. Yeah. And thank you for the question on the support.
Thank you. We have Daryl Baker, then Adam Lamont, and Mark Hummel after that. Thank you. Mr. Baker? Can we help Mr. Baker unmute? Great. Are you speaking, Mr. Baker? I'm going to come back to Mr. Baker. Adam Lamont?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. So yeah, I would echo some of the general points related to trying to allow for more flexibility to get more housing on the city, and just emphasize, that I hope the plan overall emphasizes the need for more housing across the city. I guess I would love for the city to look into doing some things similar to like what Bryan, Texas, I believe it is, in terms of having sort of modes of missing middle housing that are sort of pre-approved, designs that that make sense for within existing neighborhoods. And then other thing I'll just say is I'm interested if for Dallas that there's sort of a plan to ensure that there's like sort of excess housing for, if there's sort of a space for planning within each district, like how much housing is sort of able to be built. So just making sure that we're not pushing all development to certain parts of the city, but making sure that in the Forward Dallas land plan that, every single part of the city is being held responsible for building more housing.
And thank you, Adam, for the comment and the question. Yeah, we would love to take a look at what Bryan, Texas is doing with those modes. We've talked about that from planning and urban design, that it would be easier if we had pre-approved plans that show ADUs or duplex or triplex that are context sensitive in different types of communities. So that way it speeds up that process, and it also gets a little bit of that local concern of how this is going to look. Okay, well, if you have a say in how those those new things look, that gives you usually a little bit more vested interest in it. And so we've definitely talked about that. We've looked at other cities. A lot of it is on the West Coast. Some of it is up in the North. The stuff that Calgary is doing. But taking a look at some of those pre-approved plans or conceptualization of this is how you can do different type of housing, to Exel's point earlier, having those images and having those plans would go a long way. And as far as looking at how we are ensuring that we are developing an equitable increase in housing throughout the city, that's something that I know we're cognizant of and are pursuing, but I would not have an answer off the top of my head for you for that. But that's something that we are cognizant of, and that's something that probably David and that housing and planning urban design can work together on.
Mr. Baker, I wanted to come back to you to see if you're able to unmute at this time. All righty, I'll keep coming back. And the next on our list is Mark Ishmael.
Hi, I was wanting to ask about whether there's going to be a effort to hold in Dallas's other plans related to mostly micromobility and like the pedestrian space, like the Vision Zero plan, the bike plan, and the Complete Streets plan. I know those are separate and they also get tied up with zoning some, but I was wanting to know what steps were going to be taken to kind of use, or whether like Forward Dallas would be used to reinforce those plans, because like we had heard mentioned, there are a lot of plans that are great that aren't fully implemented in Dallas and don't even really seem like they will be. Like Vision Zero is very ambitious for zero vehicle related deaths by 2030. That's a great plan, but are we gonna, what I basically want to make sure the city is taking as powerful steps they can during this comprehensive process to make progress towards those stated goals that have already been discussed previously. And I was wondering how that was being done. And then also, I just wanted to kind of reiterate other people's points about the need for missing middle housing and raise ideas kind of like, I know transit-oriented development had been mentioned. We have a great light rail system with a lot more potential than is currently being realized. So I know some places have policies where within a quarter mile they'll of any light rail station or transit area, in order to reduce car trips, they'll uncap density or remove parking minimums, allow more housing to be built by right, that kind of thing. So near our transit stops, is it going to be a kind of a blanket rule that one of these place types that allows additional housing will be in place surrounding that general walk shed radius of a transit stop? Or is that not the plan? That's all.
Thank you, Mark, for the questions. I'll start with the last part, that the transit-oriented or the transit-adjacent development question. So we've talked about that being kind of like, I don't want to call it an overlay because it's a zoning concept, but it's somehow that it's a call out in the different types of place types. Because again, the type of TOD that you're going to get in the kind of the urban core is going to be a little different than the type of more transit adjacent development that you might get, you know, on the outer edges of Dallas. But identifying that, specifically saying, okay, this is the TOD or the TAD within this place type that, you know, speaks to, you know, lower, you know, larger sidewalks, lower requirements for, you know, for parking mandates, those type of things, or narrower streets, or, you know, additional bike capacity, that micromobility that you talked about in the beginning. Looking at that specifically at those transit-oriented and transit-adjacent areas within the different types of places. To your earlier point about micromobility and how does this plan speak to that, and how do you get from that aspirational to the brass tack stuff? Some of that is through the, okay, here's the reason why you have, you know, planning is changing the built environment to you know, to change behavior, right? That's what it is. And so if we have created development code that makes it really hard to get around without anything than a car, okay, what are those changes in our development code, right? The concrete things that we can change, and when we change them, that improves access and micromobility. And so, you know, we are looking at that through Forward Dallas. But what I also want to offer up, and I believe it was when Adam was making the comment, but it's relevant to what Adam and Mark and what a number of you have said, is your input on some of those changes, your input on some of those areas in which we might be able to weave in additional housing. You know, that is very important because, you know, I know a lot about the city of Dallas. I do not know everything. And there are a lot of things I don't know about Dallas, a lot of pockets I don't know about Dallas, a lot of things in the development code that I don't know, that our staff, you know, we'd like to be these experts, but sometimes there are things, you know, that we need that assistance on, or that can be built from the community of experts that we have within the city. So if there are those changes, right, things that you have seen, or areas that you know or believe might have the additional capacity for housing, indicate those, show us to those, talk to us about those so that we can make sure that we incorporate that into Forward Dallas. And I believe it's just past 11. I think maybe 2 more questions and then we can wrap it up. And again,
Right.
yeah, we'll share contact information after this. So if you didn't feel comfortable asking a question here, please follow up with me or Sandra or our staff, and we can definitely get that question answered or that comment added. And again, if you have additional comments, just please feel free to reach out.
Great. And next is Stephanie Champion, and then we will go back to see if Mr. Baker can join us. Stephanie?
Yes, hi, thank you. Okay, I had a couple questions, but I'll try and combine them for time's sake. I just wanted to point out that a big point of tension we see in neighborhoods as we have these conversations around land use and housing is that we know that density, building more units and increasing the overall supply of housing generally increases housing affordability, right? But unfortunately, in gentrifying neighborhoods, that has not been the case. We see the new construction, whether that's multifamily apartments, townhome developments, or infill housing, is the new construction is unaffordable and unattainable for existing residents, and it has the impact of increasing property values and housing costs across the neighborhood. So I've asked this question to staff before, but I'm going to continue to ask it until I get an answer. But like, how do we reconcile these two things, that we need density, but density also has the impact of displacing existing residents? And I think part of the answer is making sure there is some sort of interplay between these land use plans and the housing plans, right? So I'm glad David was on the call and he shared a bit about the policy being shared, being briefed to council tomorrow. One of the key recommendations of that new housing policy framework is to create these target area plans to identify community-driven strategies to achieve housing equity targets in each neighborhood and area. So I guess my specific question is, how do you foresee these potential community/neighborhood specific housing plans interacting with existing or future land use area plans or neighborhood plans?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Stephanie. So 2 things. So first, I think you answered a little bit of your first question with the second part. It's having planning and urban design work with housing and other departments. On a macro level, yes, increasing the supply of housing helps to lower housing costs. On a micro level, sometimes it has as you pointed out, sometimes that might have a great impact on on a specific community, because their housing costs are just going up, 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 and up, even as we're adding additional housing there. Because land use policies don't always do a great job of affecting unwanted displacement. They can help with that, but they need to work with other types of policies and other type of funding mechanisms or other programs or other policies to really get at that unwanted displacement. So I guess my answer is it's working with housing, working with other departments, so that we can not only increase the supply of housing through land use policies, but also then take a look specifically at communities that are still being affected by development pressures and unwanted displacement. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Patrick, if I could just add on to that. You're right. As we develop more housing, new housing, the cost of the newer housing is going to be significantly higher than homes that were built in 1950s per se, right? Just because the cost of construction is going up. What we've got to actively look at is the tools that we use to manage those costs, to bring affordability with new development to those to those areas that are at risk of displacement, right? There's no one way that you do it. It can be done with deed restrictions. It can be done with financial subsidies. It can be done with tools like community land trusts. I mean, there's a variety of ways that you can do it, but the diversity in housing types do allow for an embedded affordability component. You mentioned the thing about the community plans. We're not bringing in community plans. I think that may have been an older version of a policy that you may be looking at. We're bringing the 7 pillars and the targeted areas, but please stay tuned. There'll be a revised policy document that'll be released within the next couple of weeks. So there'll be ample time to receive comments and address questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, David. And Mr. Baker, I believe you've joined us again. I know you've had your hand up most of the time. Would you like to share something? And our last speaker will be Lisa after that. Daryl Baker. Okay, then. Lisa, would you like to join the conversation?
Sure, thank you. One of the things that I'm not sure if we can do, and so this is part of my question, is, there's been when we talk about missing middle, and particularly we talk about single family zoning, I think, there are quite a few people that say that we should just, get rid of single family zoning and everything have 4 units. But initial research is showing that particularly in historically disinvested communities, that actually ends up having a negative impact on communities of color. And so I was wondering, is it possible to have a programmatic version of gentle density? So for instance, existing homeowners may get the first opportunity to add on 1 or 2 units if they so choose, allowing them to benefit from the rental income or the benefit of density before new landholders or potential landlords or whatnot can benefit from that additional land development right.
Lisa, thank you for the question. I would say that's a little bit of planning and urban design, housing, economic development, of us coming together and understanding that. I think there was a program, I want to say in Seattle, that did something very similar to what you're talking about, where it allowed them, the first stake in ownership of that new housing, and also, I've talked with Stephanie has brought it up to us in West Dallas about how to make sure that not all the new housing, all the missing middle, just ends up in some of these areas. And so, that's something that that we're aware of and that we're working on Forward Dallas. But as far as that programmatic, that program in which you have that ability for a homeowner or a property owner or a renter, to add on or to add that type of stuff, that's something that we can definitely take a look at, but would most likely, because it gets beyond land use policy at that point. But it's definitely something that we can take a look at, and if you have examples where you've seen it done successfully, I'd be more than happy to take a look at those with you and see what we might be able to explore.
Thanks, Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. Patrick, we are right on time. I just want to extend a thank you to everyone for joining us today. David, do you have any parting words for us on this very healthy conversation?
No, I just appreciate you having me here, and I really appreciate the comments, and just encourage folks, if you can tune in tomorrow at 9 a.m., I encourage you to do so. We'll be having a discussion with the City Council around that proposed housing policy. Thanks.
Great. Patrick?
Again, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the questions and the comments. Please feel free to reach out afterwards if you have anything you want to discuss about later. And also, I would also encourage you to go watch David tomorrow. Yeah.
Yes, and then if you have nothing else to do today, you can join Patrick and I at 12 o'clock. We're going to be talking to the nonprofit sector, and the listening sessions continue for the remainder of the week. So thank you all, and please remain safe and warm. Good afternoon.